Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Haley Deshane, and I'm the Events Coordinator here at Eco Canada. Welcome to the Navigating OBPS, TIER, and CFS Credits Creation, Utilization, Risks, and Case Studies webinar funded by the ECCC. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the traditional Indigenous lands where Eco Canada's office is based in Calgary. At Eco Canada, we're committed to working towards respectful acknowledgement, collaboration, and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples across Canada. This starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within the Treaty 7 territory. Today, we are presenting from the City of Calgary, home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. We would also like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Niitsitapi, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina and Goodstoney, which include Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. I also want to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session to ensure that everyone can enjoy and participate in our session effectively. So all participants are muted. Make sure that you could hear us properly. If you're experiencing any technical issues, use the chat function on the left-hand side of your screen, and we could do our best to resolve it for you. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available for your viewing in 24 hours. Any questions that you have about the presentation or today's topic can be submitted through the question box. We will have dedicated time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you have. Finally, we really want to know what you think about our webinars and how we can keep improving. You'll be sent a short survey after the webinar ends. Please let us know what you think or if you have any comments or suggestions. Eco Canada's vision is to build the world's leading environmental workforce. Eco Canada seeks to help environmental workers succeed at each step of their career journey. To do this, Eco Canada has developed programs tailored to individuals at different stages of their career. For those looking to enter the environmental workforce, Eco Canada provides training through the BEAR program. You can learn more about that on our Facebook page. We also provide opportunities for new workers to break into the environmental sector through wage funding for co-op students and recent post-secondary graduates. For those already employed as environmental workers, Eco Canada provides the Environmental Professional EP and Environmental Professional in Training EPT certifications and EPT students. Lastly, Eco Canada provides opportunities for those with vast experience as environmental workers to provide guidance and direction to Eco Canada's products and programs through advisory committees and emeritus memberships. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. Joining us is Martin Delaney. Martin Delaney specializes in both sustainable transactional products and commercial surety. Martin is based in Calgary, Alberta, and leads the Sustainable Transactions team, which assists our energy, power, construction, and manufacturing clients in protecting their balance sheets on their journey to net zero. Martin is working with both clients and insurance markets to develop and place transactional insurance that protects carbon trading, CCUS, DAC projects, and renewable energy projects. All right, Martin, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. Thank you to Eco Canada and Environment Climate Change Canada for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today on the national carbon credit landscape. And we are going to be looking at carbon pricing, provincial programs, the federal OBPS program, the Canadian fuel standards. In addition, I'm going to look at a couple of provincial programs, Alberta TIER, the Ontario EPS, and then we're going to talk about clean fuel regs, look at a case study and talk about some of the risks associated with CCUS or CCS projects as they develop and evolve over the coming years. I will preface this presentation in my comments. As everyone is aware, we've had a change of government in the U.S., and we are going to have our own federal election probably sooner than later, where we will probably see some changes to this legislation and to the regulations. What we're talking about is regulation, not tax. So there will be modifications as we go forward. So it's important for everyone to stay on top of a very dynamic situation, to be proactive, to look for information as you approach. If you're coming from from an educational perspective, if you're coming from an investment perspective, or from a project point of view, you need to stay on top of these things. And we'll talk a little bit about the risks involved, both financially and the physical risks, liability, property, casualty, those types of things. So let's start then, shall we, with the first slide, and that covered off what we're going to cover. Now we're going to talk about carbon pricing. So carbon pricing involves recognizing the cost of pollution, and since 2019, every region in Canada has implemented a carbon pricing system. Alberta was the first to do this back in 2007, and so the federal government establishes a minimum standard, and we call that the federal benchmark. And every province and territory marks its progress against the benchmark. The pricing system consists of two components: a regulatory charge on fossil fuels like gasoline and natural gas, called the fuel charge. And what I've talked about, the performance-based system for industries, known federally as the output-based pricing system. Now, that the first point there, the fuel charge, maybe some people recognize that as the retail carbon tax that a lot of policymakers are talking about changing or eliminating. But the other output-based pricing system is the federal credit system that I'm going to focus on today. Both components at this point of the federal pricing system are in effect in a number of different provinces. So Manitoba, Nunavut, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon, so both territories and provinces. The federal fuel charge is applied alongside provincial carbon pricing systems for industries in Alberta, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, Nova Scotia, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. So that carbon pollution pricing system in BC, the Northwest Territories, and Quebec meets the benchmark. So neither component of the federal pricing system is applied in those jurisdictions that I just mentioned. So it's a combination of both, and the next slide, as it comes up, will show you how that breaks out across the country. So next slide is from the Government of Canada, and it shows a breakdown of as I said, all the different provincial jurisdictions. So the revenue from the federal carbon pricing system stays within the province or territory where it's collected. The proceeds from the federal carbon pricing system are used to encourage green transitional, energy transitional programs. So provinces and territories that opt for the federal system receive these funds directly, and then the other jurisdictions collect and use those funds separately. The retail carbon tax, that fuel tax rates that I mentioned earlier, will probably see some major refinement or maybe even possibly elimination in 2025. So if you look at this chart, and you can find that on the Government of Canada website, ECCC, you can see that in Alberta, we have the tier system. Saskatchewan has their own carbon tax base. Of course, Quebec works with California, the cap and trade system. Ontario has changed a couple of times over the last couple of years from cap and trade to EPS. We'll talk about Alberta and Ontario a little bit more in depth later on in the presentation. But you can see across the country, we have programs that meet the federal legislation, but they're either run locally or with the government. So the current federal, and let's focus now on OBPS. On the next slide, we can talk about the current federal system. So the offset system is a market-based initiative designed to encourage voluntary projects to reduce GHG emissions or to remove them altogether. While the system primarily targets large emitters subject to the federal pricing, any entity in Canada can purchase offset credits from the system. And that's important to understand. For each ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent reduced, a project earns one offset credit. And they're called different things across the country, but essentially it is a carbon credit. And these credits can be utilized by industries to fulfill their compliance obligations and thereby helping to lower the overall cost of their compliance. Additionally, businesses and governments across the country can use these credits to support their carbon neutral or net zero emissions goals. So if we do go to the next slide, you can see we get into some of the detail of the GHG offset credit system. To qualify for offset credits, projects activities must achieve a greenhouse gas or GHG reduction or removal that exceeds the standard practices and legal requirements, but not already incentivized by existing carbon pricing mechanisms. So the whole point of carbon credits, and whatever you want to call them in whatever jurisdiction you're in, is to enhance and to accelerate an energy transition, whether that be through carbon capture storage or carbon capture utilization and storage or direct air capture. It could be methane elimination. There are a number of different protocols and ways of creating these offset credits. And this system, while not totally harmonized across the country, do incentivize locally projects to help in this energy transition. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the overall Canadian system. The offset credit system encourages municipalities, Indigenous communities, foresters, farmers, and other project developers to create innovative projects that reduce greenhouse emissions. Now, this can be through technology. This could be through nature-based additionality projects. Of course, forestry comes to mind on the nature-based, as well on technology side is the CCS and CCUS projects that I talked about earlier. By registering and implementing projects that meet these GHG credit system regulations or a relevant federal or provincial offset protocol, project proponents can earn these offset credits. And these credits can be used, again, to pay the carbon tax or to trade internally within that jurisdiction, whether it be Tier or Ontario, BC, or whatever. Now, I don't want to get into the weeds too much. There really isn't a spot market for compliance credits, and not to get confused with voluntary credits. We're talking about Canadian-based regulatory compliance credits, and that's the focus of this discussion. Credits are tradable units that represent verified reductions, either by lowering or increasing the removal of GHGs from the atmosphere. And each credit is equivalent, again, to 1 ton of carbon dioxide reduced or removed. So These credits can be sold or used for compliance by facilities participating in the federal OBPS or in a provincial program. So again, you might have heard about the voluntary carbon market. Certainly, that is a global trading system. There's a process, of course, to get these credits verified and then registered on a different registry. So later on, we're going to talk about the CATS, which is the Canadian Federal Credit Registry. In Alberta, it's called CSA. These are where credits are registered. Once they have been verified and the regulator has signed off, they sit in this registry. They can be traded multiple times, or they can be used to pay and reduce their carbon tax. So let's talk about, on this next slide, let's talk about the federal offset protocol. And there's 3 protocols, and these are the federal ones, and again, we'll talk about provincial ones later. Protocols set out requirements for implementation and qualifying GHG emissions given different project types. The offset protocol will be able to generate federal offset credits in Canada's GHG offset credit system. So the 3 protocols are landfill methane reduction and destruction, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from refrigeration systems, and improved forest management on private land. And I've listed here the publication dates for those regulations. And in the 3rd column, provinces and territories where the protocol is applicable for landfill methane recovery everywhere except BC, Alberta, and Quebec, because they have their own protocols. Reducing greenhouse emissions from refrigeration systems, that's across the country. And then the forest management, that is everywhere except British Columbia, because they have their own system there. But these are the 3 federally mandated protocols. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start talking about Alberta and the Alberta TIER program. So TIER stands for Technology Innovation Emissions Reduction. And the TIER is Alberta's industrial carbon pricing and emissions trading system. And as I said earlier, Alberta introduced the first North American system, price on carbon tracking system, back in 2007. So there's a long history of that, of this type of program within the province, and it encourages industrial facilities to innovate, to reduce emissions, and investing in clean technology, helping them maintain competitive and also save money. So the TIER regulation, which meets the federal standard, regulates facilities, including those that emit greater than 100,000 tons of CO2 per year back in 2016 or any subsequent year. So that's where that benchmark, or that's where that trigger to get you into the TIER system. Facilities with emissions less than those thresholds may opt in to the regulation if the facility competes directly with another regulated facility and emits 2,000 tons of carbon or more and belongs to an emission-intensive, trade-exposed sector. So this gives smaller facilities and project developers the opportunity to opt into the TIER program and to create offset credits and carbon credits as to match the 18 protocols that we find in Alberta. Facilities under TIER receive an exemption to the federal fuel charge under the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, as TIER meets federal requirements. So this is on, again, GHG emissions, carbon credits, and we could spend an hour or a couple of hours just talking about the Alberta TIER system, because it is a well-used system. It is fairly well understood. It's probably none of these regulations are sort of uh, easy to follow. There is a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of steps to get to credit creation, but that's a whole different conversation in itself. Purpose of our talk today is just to give you a really uh, a large, like a survey of what we're seeing in different parts across the country. The next slide, we're going to talk about the Ontario system. So Ontario emissions performance standards, and like I said earlier, there's been a lot of different variations and programs in Ontario over the years. They had a cap and trade system that was they pulled out of. Ontario's EPS, Emissions Performance Standards Program, replaced the federal output-based system that was in place in Ontario from 2019 to 21. The EPS program has stricter benchmarks and criteria than OBPS and extends the program to 2030. Ontario has made regulatory amendments to their program to meet the federal benchmark, as I said, to continue the program from 2023, when it was introduced, to 2030. It wants to be responsive to its stakeholders' interests, improve program implementation and administration. This is oftentimes is a sticking point for these programs. They tend to be, highly complicated because, we're dealing with scientifically based on the technology side, how to capture the information, how do you monitor, how do you create the credits, how you get them verified, registered. There's a lot of administration involved, and rightly so, because there's been, uh, credits that have been invalidated, that have projects that have underperformed. So we want to make sure that it's almost a race to the top to get Canadian carbon credits of a very high quality and therefore make them very desirable and impactful for what we're trying to do through these programs. And the Pro EPS program also harmonizes with all federal reporting requirements. So that's the Ontario program. It is running now, It's up and running, and it touches the electrification of their grid, net zero. So it's an important program that we see in Ontario. I'm going to switch gears now and move into another federally regulated program, and that is around the clean fuel regulations. And I'm going to give you highlights around CFR. So Canadian fuel regulations, this is not the fuel tax. These are regulations around reducing the carbon intensity of our fuels. This is a federally mandated program. It is harmonized with EPA standards in the US and with CARB in California and some of the other low carbon fuel standards that we see on America's West Coast and in British Columbia. The point and what we're trying to do with the CFR is to really limit the amount of carbon emissions from the fuels. This allows clean fuel producers to sell their credits once they are created in Canada. The regulations set declining CI standards for fossil fuels and require fuel producers and importers to reduce the carbon intensity to meet annual thresholds over time. So this is a moving target to reduce they talk about CI, carbon intensity of the fuels. And so there's a number of different ways. We see that with biofuels, biodiesel, conversion to hydrogen-powered fleets, EV-based vehicles, EV-based transportation. So we are working with the US, as I said, and the EPA and some of the regulations out of the US, where these big, if we look at transportation, big fleets, where some of these units can run, they're like $600,000 to $700,000 for the technology to convert and to reduce the carbon intensity of their fleets. The primary goal of the Canadian clean fuel regs is to reduce the average CI consumed by 15%, so below the 2016 baseline levels. We want to get there. Every year there's a new standard to meet. Regulated companies are fuel suppliers. These are producers and importers. They must register for the CFR. Voluntary participants are fleet operators, fuel suppliers, not regulated, but they can opt in to create these clean fuel credits. These are compliance credits that fulfill a regulatory obligation, and they're not voluntary offsets. So again, this is a compliance program. It is in full force and effect. And as I said, if you produce fuel, if you import fuel, there are carbon intensity standards that must be met every year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the compliance categories on the next slide of the clean fuel regulations. And similar to the GHG legislation, there are different categories and different people involved. So the CFR established a compliance credit market whereby the annual carbon intensity reduction requirements that can be met create credits through these three different types of actions. So compliance category number one, reduce carbon intensity of fossil fuels. So that would be that first group of suppliers or creators of fuel. How do you reduce that carbon or that CI? By undertaking projects that reduce the CI of fossil fuels. And this is through carbon credit sequestration, CCUS, on-site renewables, and renewables feedstocks into the fuels to reduce that CI. So that is compliance category number one for those importers and creators of fuels. The second compliance category where you can create offset credits, supply low carbon intense fuels. Okay, and that is done by supplying customers with these low CI fuels. That's ethanol, biodiesel, hydrogen derived from renewable diesel. So from renewable sources, and that includes renewable diesel. So that is another way of creating credits in category number two. Now, compliance category number three is the end use fuel switching. So dispensing, how do you do that? And how do you create dispensing low GHG fuels for uses in vehicles? That's plug-in electricals, hydrogen fuels and fleets, or natural gas vehicles, which you see in many Canadian cities with transit are run by natural gas. So the CFR is a national program that you can create another type of carbon credit or credit to trade, to pay down your fuel, your carbon tax. And there's a number of different ways that you can create credits, and different people are obligated to be in the program and other can opt in. And basically, these are the three federal compliance categories. I know this is a lot of information. Just, I'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, and I'll be happy to entertain that. So the next slide talks about the CAT system. So earlier I had mentioned that project developers or large emitters that have CCUS or any kind of carbon credit creation projects, you have to register these credits where they're maintained. This is transparent. They are open, transparent registries. For the federal system, whether it be CFR or the OBPS credits, they are tracked in what's called the CAT system. So this is for primarily suppliers, voluntary credit creators. When I say voluntary, I'm talking about those who opt into the program, carbon intensity contributors, foreign suppliers, verification bodies for the clean fuel regs. Everybody must create an account in CATS. So later I can send you information about register and how that all works. But what the CAT system does, it tracks compliant obligations. Surplus credit issuance is where you transfer, or revoke or cancel credits, and remittance of carbon units or compliance units and payables, payments under the federal OBPS. So basically, this CAT system is a comprehensive tracking, trading system for federal credits. So, in addition to compliance, suppliers and creators of fuels registering on the CAT system, registration, reporting, offset, credit issuance, transfer, retirement, suspension, revocation, cancellation, as well as compliance obligation, remittance of compliance units, and payments under Canada's GHG offset credit system. So suffice it to say, the CAT system is a very comprehensive and flexible system that anyone involved with federal carbon credits must register on, and it's a multi-use tracking system. Registration applications, reporting and issuance of compliance credits under CFR regs. So it's, as I said, used on a number of different credit systems, including CFR, including OBPS. It is all found on the CAT system. It's all tracked on that system, and everybody needs to register. But again, it's very transparent and it's an open system. Now, provincially, as I mentioned, with Ontario and Alberta, they have their own, when it comes to carbon credits, their own tracking systems, CSA in Alberta, as an example. But for federal credits, we have to use the CAT system. So with all this information I've been sharing with you, it tends to get pretty complicated. And I want to talk a little bit right now about some of the risks associated and a case study on how you can actually create these credits. So if we flip to the next slide, of course, many of you have heard about CCS projects. And there's all different types of ways of creating carbon credits or offset credits, as we've talked about. But I'd like just to focus on one that is very much in the news and is, an important way of sequestering carbon. And that is carbon capture and storage, what is called CCS. And I'm just going to talk about what it is exactly. So for some of you, you'll understand this. For others, it may be new. This is a process that involves capturing CO2 emissions from industrial facilities. It often involves capturing CO2 from large sources like a nat gas processing plant. And before they're released into the atmosphere, they are sequestered. So imagine a large natural gas facility creates a lot of carbon as well as energy, and they will take that carbon and they will pipe it to a storage area. They capture the CO2 that is then transported, normally by a pipeline, to a long-term storage site, typically a deep geographic formation. These are called Precambrian saline geographical reservoirs. And within that reservoir, they will pump in this CO2. Now, we're really good at taking fossil fuels out of the ground, And we're also very good, those same industries are very good about putting carbon back into the ground, into these, what we call them reservoirs, these deep basins. So these are saline based reservoirs where this carbon is then captured forever is the goal. So approximately 80% of the CO2 captured each year is used for enhanced oil recovery. That's called, you might have heard of EOR, where CO2 is injected into partially depleted oil reserves to extract more oil and where the CO2 remains underground. Because EOR both utilizes and stores CO2, CCS is also referred to as CCUS, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So here's an example of, and there are many projects in the books waiting to be launched. There are a couple of CCUS projects and CCS projects in Western Canada that are developing. And this is where, as I said, you have large emitters that want to take that carbon that is produced. Now, this can be a conventional gas plant, or this could be something like the oil sands, where you might have heard of the Pathways Group, or Pathways Alliance, where those oil sand developers want to take the carbon and sequester it as well. So when you think about this case study or this example, there's a lot of risks and a lot of things that need to be considered. And on the next slide, I want to talk about a little bit of where the carbon credits or the offset credits that are created from these projects, how they can be used and incentivized for these projects. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about how you can stack carbon credits in Canada for a CCUS or CCS project. So imagine you've got your provincial credits and you've got your federal clean fuel regs. You can stack those credits to incentivize the development. These are very expensive projects, and governments are trying to encourage this type of development by creating carbon credits. That's the point, is to get us to a lower carbon economy, and we do that by developing credits and stacking credits. And there is also incentive tax credits. That's a different discussion, but they can be also used. So in this particular study, you can take and stack those credits, and this makes the project more financially viable. It gets it to FID, which is final investment decision date, where these projects then are shovel ready and they start. To incur qualified CCUS expenditures in a tax year or previous tax year before the first day of commercial operations for the relevant qualified project. So these projects have to be approved federally, provincially, and once they are approved, then you can start using some of these carbon credits and start to stack them. Another provision to stack them, they need to be issued an initial project evaluation for each qualified project and complete a FEED study, taking the pre-screening and questionnaire and submitting the project to NRCan, Natural Resources Canada. Right, so all to say is there's a lot of upfront work that needs to be done to get it qualified, to meet the standard, to be able to create credits. And this process is getting better all the time. It's getting sped up, but it's still a process that these companies work with NRCan and consultants to launch these CCUS projects. Once they need to be registered in NRCan's secure project plan submission portal and complete a project plan form. So just to say that you can stack these credits. Two, there is a process to be able to do it, but it does exist, and it does make these projects financially viable in the long term. So I want to talk a little bit now in closing about the risks associated. We've talked about carbon credits. We talked about the federal, provincial programs. We've talked about how they are created, where they are registered, and how you can use them to, you know, to encourage and to get these projects off the ground. So, as you can imagine, as we can see on the next slide, there are ways to mitigate the financial and the physical risk associated with these projects. There are wrap programs, insurance wrap programs that protect what we call the technology around the carbon reduction. That could be through methane, that can be through all this, direct air capture, CCUS. Some of this is tried and true technology, and some of it's quite new technology. So the green technology performance insurance, that kind of insurance protects in case the technology issued during CCUS startup or long-term, it covers that startup phase and the long-term performance of that technology. Coverage for engineering, manufacturing, construction, and operations of the CCUS project. So there's that technology, new tech coverage that protects the financial viability of the project. And as Haley at the top of the webinar mentioned, my focus, my practice is to protect the financial balance sheet or of a company, of a project, to enhance, speed up these processes, which are lengthy, using different tools to get to FID, that final investment decision, to get these CCUS, direct air, and this is primarily focused in technology, but there is also application to nature-based additionality as well. So you can also insure these carbon credits against invalidation, because there is a number of different ways that they can be invalidated, and that is a risk and exposure and liability on your balance sheet. These credits can be protected against invalidation due to stated triggers like fraud, leakage, negligence, serialization impairment, regulatory change, etc. So there are ways of protecting the credits once they are created, and that sort of wraps them and makes them more valuable, makes them more tradable, what we call fungible, adds to the fungibility of the credit and the quality of that credit. I had mentioned that there are also tax incentives, tax insurance as well, CCUS, ITCs. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but the federal government has tax incentives, and you can insure those to provide long-term stability, and it significantly boosts the economics of a sequestration project. There's also insurances, what they're called contingency business insurances, and BI or CBI. These are third-party coverages, insurance that protect the credit revenue as a result of a halt to CCS operations due to a stated trigger. And that could be the parties that you're working with, their technology breaks down, you don't get the feedstock into the reservoir. There's all these contingencies that can happen that will impact the financial viability of the project. Those risks can be mitigated and covered as well. So on the next page, I'm going to talk a little bit about the operational exposure and how insurance can protect that as well. Implications for property, BI and CBI that I talked about. And you see on the left-hand side, you can stack these coverages, the physical, the excess property program. Property would include boiler, machinery, BI, CBI that we talked about earlier. These are usually Lloyd's underwriters with different BI waiting periods. But all risk property and BI and CBI coverages, they protect the project meeting its testing and commissioning criteria within the insurance policy. You got coverage for physical damage. You've got coverage for the stated triggers, and this can be for direct air capture projects, for CCUS projects, on the whole facility in the event that they can't operate or cannot generate their carbon credits. And all these projects are based on the fact that you can create credits. So when you have a physical or financial risk, you have to mediate against that exposure. And on the next slide, from that planning stage or construction stage to the operation stage, there is a whole plethora of insurances that you need to cover for operational the operation of the project. And again, you can look. Here's an example where you have a couple of excess layers. You've got commercial general liability. You may have a self-insured portion. All to say that there are insurances and insurance markets out there that really want to promote and support these types of carbon capture projects, and who want to create a virtuous cycle of sequestering carbon, lowering carbon intensity, and ensuring that these projects are not only financially viable in the long term, but physically can operate. So my last slide really talks a little bit about, goes further in depth around credit invalidation. And this goes for technology-based and nature-based additionality programs. And, carbon offset and emission credits are the key drivers for regulators to incentivize these types of investment in green tech and to support the energy transition. These carbon credit insurance products, and there are a number out there. There's not a lot, but there are a few markets. It's very new business. It's new coverage, but it does exist, and I work with those markets, and they insure the underlying project entity and the owner of the credits being the lost payee. So basically, if you trade or sell, those credits are insured along that value chain. And as I mentioned before, this coverage covers stated triggers that include fraud, duplication, regulatory deficiency, leakage, loss, serialization impairment, anything along those lines. So these are for both compliance credits that we've been talking about today, and also voluntary credits as well. So that leaves a few minutes that we can talk. If you've got any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. The last slide can tell you where you can get a hold of me if you want to ask some questions. Really appreciated this opportunity to talk about a very dense subject, but one that is really important, drives a lot of innovation, and again, caution everybody to stay informed, be prepared, and because there's risk involved in the energy transition, and we're very mindful here on how we can help clients, generators, end users in their journey to a lower carbon intensity and a low carbon economy. So if there are a couple of questions, I can entertain them. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Martin. We do have a few questions. If anyone else has any more, please put them in the question box and I can ask them for you. So first, we have, how might upcoming policy changes or regulatory updates affect the landscape for these credits?
Yes, well, I mean, we can only speculate at this point, but as I said, there's a lot of risk, financial risk and physical risk associated in the creation of carbon credits, whether they be the federal program or provincial programs. These projects are not going to go away. They may change, but I believe that the protocols that have been established will be maintained. Now, maybe the annual schedule of pricing for compliance credits may change. They may stop at $100 or freeze at the 2025 benchmark? I don't know. But we have to remember that these are regulations that drive credit creation and not the carbon tax. That's two different things. If you keep that in mind, you can, there is a distinction there. So I think it behooves us to be maintain, read up, to be proactive, to be resilient, to understand that there are definitely risks involved, but there are ways of mitigating risks, and you need to work with the right team, the right people to figure out in your particular situation what will happen, what changes for you, your project, or where you want to work in the green in green technology, if you will. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Martin. Another one, this is kind of a two-parter. How
Okay.
can how can businesses, do you want me to split it up?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, well, go ahead. Split it
Okay,
up.
how can businesses integrate the creation and utilization of OBPS tiers and CFS credits into their broader sustainability strategies?
Well, I mean, it takes a concerted effort and a very thoughtful process. I come from an ERM background, enterprise risk management, so I tend to look at things holistically, and that's how I found my way into this type of sustainable transactional insurance products, whether it be trade credit to protect accounts receivable, structured surety, technology covers whatever. I think every company has to be one very mindful of their business plan, where they're operating, what is available to them, which jurisdictions, what are the exposures, how do you manage those risks, how do you transfer that risk, how do you avoid risks. Look at it very very much holistically. I think an informed person or company or project is got to be the way to go. And some of the insurances that I talked about, you know, bring in the experts early into the process, get the engineers involved, get the geologists involved early, project management, and also get your insurance person, broker, whomever you're dealing with, start them thinking about how that project and how your overall program will withstand the risk that it will face as you develop until you get to that final investment decision and then project launch, or just the whole ESG conversation. Now, this, carbon and my practice really focuses on the environmental impacts, So there's a lot to be considered there. Not so much on the S and the G, the social and the governance, which all plays a part in that ESG world. But I'm very much focused on and working with companies to think about that long-term strategy around uh, uh, credit creation and sustainability over the long term.
Thanks. Yeah,
Ready for the second part?
you kind of touched on the second part already, but are there best practices for aligning credit utilization with long-term emission reduction goals?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And again, I would say that it is very, uh, it's very bespoke. But yes, absolutely. You need to create, that conversation or that strategy within an organization to to uh, to develop the credits, to protect them, to make sure you've got the right audience, that you're working with the right partners, you've got the right technology. It's a very, very holistic and you have to approach it eyes wide open and from a number of different angles. So it's very much it takes a village kind of mentality to get to a successful conclusion and to utilize the credits accordingly and to be successful in the long term.
Thank you. And last question. How are
Right.
carbon credits quantified for emission reduction measures in furniture manufacturing? What is the minimum reduction required to earn a carbon credit?
Okay, well, that's not an easy question to answer right off the cuff. It would depend on jurisdiction, geography, protocol, supply chain, a number of different considerations. I would suggest that any company looking to reduce carbon or to see if there is an opportunity to create credits, to pay the carbon tax or to sell to a large emitter, that's a discussion that has to be had at a high level with a consultancy, with an insurance broker like myself, or others in the business. There is so many different factors that I couldn't really give a comprehensive answer because of all those different factors that you have to consider as you build these projects.
Thank you. So that wraps up today's webinar. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Martin, for this
Yeah, thank you.
presentation. Keep everyone check out our events calendar for any more upcoming webinars and events that we have coming up, including Eco Impact, our conference in February here in Calgary. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Martin. His email is on the screen, or you can email me at events@eco.ca. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.